Dr. Werniak, would you like to begin?
Sure. Thank you so much, Aurora. Just to reintroduce myself, if you weren't here at the beginning of the conversation, I'm Dr. Larissa Werniak. I'm the program head for American Studies, and I'm going to be moderating the conversation today. I would certainly like to include your questions after having viewed the film, so feel free to put those into the chat if you would like to do so. Otherwise, you might just be held hostage by me, and I will begin to rant about one of my favorite subjects like gerrymandering or critical race theory, and you'll be held captive and it will all be terrible. So don't let me do that. So I want just to introduce Dr. Fair and Dr. Naqvi, who are going to be participating in our session today. Dr. Fair, of course, is the Dean of the School of Interdisciplinary Studies, and Dr. Naqvi is another one of our faculty members. And I was hoping that we could open just by allowing each of you a little bit of time to respond to the film. One of the reasons that I really am so pleased that Dr. Fair is able to join us today is that I know he brings a different perspective to the table as somebody who I believe was in college during the civil rights movement, has firsthand experience of some of the things that we've only seen on film. And I know from personal experience that I've benefited so enormously from listening to the firsthand experiences from family members, from friends from that generation, really hearing what they have to say. And I think given Baldwin's emphasis on witness in particular, that we really can benefit from this opportunity of hearing from somebody who has had this set of experiences. So Dr. Fair, if you had any opening words, any reflections on the film, what you noticed or observed, I will turn to you first, and then go to Dr. Naqvi after that.
Okay, can you see me, you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, good. Well, I think the film was quite enlightening. I think it really raises the question of what does it mean to be Black in America? And I think as we think about that question, it has lots of ramifications. But I think as we go forward, as we continue to think about that, it's something that we can, there's no one answer to, but it gives us some insight. Another question that is raised in the film is they talk about having a Black become president. And as you know, maybe you can, he said, maybe you can become a president. And so we can think about the short piece that they have in there with Barack Obama, which he really did become president, okay? And a Black became president, something that quite 40 years ago, many people really didn't think about, that it was a possibility. So I think it's not a major part of the film, but it really shows us that there is some reason for optimism. I think the other thing that you see that you can recognize in the film that has several pieces or several vignettes where they show police brutality. And we know that in this time where Black Lives Matter, that we see and we hear about police brutality every day. And so we have to think about how that focuses and how that affects our living in this country and how that affects Blacks particularly, and what the relationship is between Blacks and whites and especially the police, as we have to see as we go on and see the day-to-day trials and tribulations that we have with police brutality. I think that, the story of the Negro in America, the story of Blacks in America is not a pretty story, but Blacks continue to be optimistic. And I think that's something that you can see from the vignettes that they have. And they continue to be Black optimistic because it's really our home. It's the home of Black folks. And it's the only home that we really know. And so I think that even though you have some trials and tribulations, that the story is not all, the ending or the conclusion is not all bad, that we have to be optimistic if we want to go on and live from day to day, that we have to have an optimistic viewpoint. I think we said that he cannot be a pessimist. Baldwin talks about being a pessimist quite a bit, but he really says that he cannot be a pessimist, that overall he's not a pessimist. And we can see that even though there are lots of, I might say, negative aspects, I think overall the story is one of a future. And I think that that's the future that we have to see for Black folks. And I think if you're going to live in this country and continue to be an upstanding member of the society, you have to be an optimist. I think that he highlighted the deaths of Martin Luther King and Medgar Evers and Malcolm X, and yes, all those men were slain prior to their 40th birthday. And so that shows us some of the violence that we have and some of the trials that we still have to overcome. And I think that's a fitting tribute to them, but that they did so much in the early part of their lives and that they were all taken from us by the time they were 40. So I think that's enough for me to get started with and let other people comment. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your comments. I feel like there's so much that you've offered that we could probably go on that for quite a while. But one thing that I really wanted to emphasize that you've said that I thought was a particularly significant aspect of the film kind of pertains to that issue. The idea of that we can't be pessimistic, that there's sort of this inability to go forward if that is our sole perspective. And, when I think about Baldwin and his role in society, the ways that he is really, that he's occupying this position of ambivalence in a way that, it can be so difficult to do when you are an activist, a politician, and to, think about kind of the role for a humanist in society in this way, being able to intervene in some of these ways to acknowledge that ambiguity, the complexity of these issues in ways that other public figures can't. So I think that that's a really important point of focus. Dr. Naqvi, I'll turn to you now, and just if there's any place you'd like to open, any particular thoughts you'd like to begin with.
Sure, thanks. Thank you. One of the things that really struck me in this particular film is that at the beginning, and then it returns to at the end, sort of a rejection of this question of the quote unquote Negro problem, right? And sort of framing it as, a lot of times when we talk about race in America, I mean, even something as simple as like in this previous debate for the presidency talking about, race and violence in America, how do we understand this problem? It sort of frames it as external to the greater population of the country, as something that's confined to a minority group within the country. And he rejects this sort of early in the piece, and then again at the end, and highlights the fact that this is a fundamentally question at the heart of how America has become the country it is, or in the founding of the country. The creation of this idea of the N-word they use in this, right, and that doesn't happen by accident. It's because there's a purpose it serves for the society. And, in some ways I see echoes of this in the work of Ta-Nehisi Coates when he talks about reparations and saying that if society in America writ large doesn't want to grapple with the meanings of these past actions and understand why we've made these decisions to go down these paths, then the problem isn't just for Black Americans or any other minority group that faces discrimination. The problem will be for the nation as a whole, and the nation won't be able to step forward and be able to solve ongoing issues. I mean, he even talks about this notion of why are cities unsafe? Why are we having such a level of dissatisfaction? Why is there these mass violence outbreaks? And we saw in the film, right? I mean, the selections for violence, they're not highlighting, problems of Black people killing white people or anything like that. I mean, they're picking instances that were like these mass shootings, which are perpetrated by white folk towards other white folk, right? But he's linking that. I mean, film choices are linking that because obviously Baldwin had passed before those things, but linking this idea that there's this greater disharmony in the country that exists that has tentacles that reach really deeply because we haven't really grappled with this problem. So I thought that's a really powerful way of putting this. And the other thing that really struck me, and I think is one of the most powerful aspects of the film, is the way in which Baldwin explains why we won't, as a nation, grapple with these issues. I think that to me was really striking, this idea that like we've sort of conditioned ourselves as Americans to not be able to understand why African Americans would be upset about their status in society or the treatment that they face, because if we understood that problem, it would be something that would crash down so many issues onto our own lives and how we've gotten to be where we are in a society that we would be unable to grapple with it in some ways. And so it's almost like this society, he's almost arguing that the society can't function without having this collective amnesia towards that. And that's really hard for me, like what strikes me about that is that how does one solve that problem? You know, that obviously this film, the point of the film is not to be like, here's solutions to this problem that's existed in the United States for hundreds of years. But it's one of those things when we're grappling with that as a thing. I think there's a reason why at the end of the film, they go back to Baldwin arguing that he's not a pessimist, because I think it's really easy to walk away from that being like, okay, well, if the structures of the society only exist because we have this collective amnesia towards the history of the country, it's very easy to just be like, well, I guess that's what we have to have. And so I actually am struggling a bit with the idea of being optimistic in that framework and how to apply some of that as you go forward. And I know that's not the point of the film, but it's a question that I'm sort of grappling with, having seen it a couple of times.
Yeah, Dr. Naki, I think you have encapsulated that so eloquently. And I agree with you completely about just the significance of Baldwin's intervention here. You know, the ability to cut away so much of the palaver of the debate and to almost say that even as race, of course, has been this incredibly significant component of the American experience, it's not about race, it's about power, it's about inequity, it's about these other deeper things, and this is a symptom as opposed to the heart of the problem itself. And I wonder, you know, I'm so struck by some of the recent comments of President Trump on Constitution Day, which I believe also, if I'm remembering correctly, is when Ruth Bader Ginsburg died. So kind of all of these things happening at once, you know, but Trump speaking explicitly to the teaching of history and the way that he believes that history is being taught inappropriately by these interventions like the 1619 Project in the New York Times. He's talking about critical theory and critical race theory, which I doubt he understands. And, you know, I think that your comments have really made me consider some of the ways that we're using history itself as a battleground, the teaching of history, the understandings of history, the tellings of these stories as kind of part of this battle as well. I'm not sure if that's something that you'd like to talk about, but I think that is a really significant kind of current application of some of the ideas that are being expressed here.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think I really appreciate how you kind of tied that to some of these things that are kind of ongoing about how contentious the stories we tell are about what our history is as a country, as well as how we understand the role of, you know, categories like race in it. And, you know, one of the things that I think is really striking about this conversation is actually to link it back to what Baldwin's saying about this idea of pessimism versus optimism. I feel this fairly acutely as someone who, you know, is in teaching American studies, right? I mean, we're teaching the stories of America, and how do you balance that optimism and pessimism thing when you're trying to tell a true story about the history of the country, right? As Baldwin pointed out, right? I mean, the story of Black Americans is the story of America, right? And then there's a fundamental truth to that. And then at the same time, like, how do former President Obama was, in some ways, I think, the most optimistic public figure I've ever seen on this front. I mean, his speech that he gave, his farewell address, was able to do better than I think anybody I've ever seen, to take, in many ways, the struggles and the tragedies of African American history and roll it into this very positive narrative about the forward movement of the nation towards living up to its ideals. And there are times when I think about that narrative that I wonder if that's a narrative that's nice, and so it would be great if that's true, or whether actually it is true. And I struggle with that sometimes, and I think that that's part of what this. It's part of what I think is some of the irony about these controversies over teaching American history, because it should be glaringly obvious that if you exclude a very significant portion of the population from the central narrative of the history that you're telling, that you're not telling a very complete story. But at the same time, there are other people who have very much made a conscious effort to put people in their proper positions in the story of American history, and yet they still come to vastly different conclusions about what the interpretation should be about this, in this basic idea of pessimism versus optimism about what America is about. And I think sometimes it can be really simplistic to, go to one extreme or the other and say that either the nation's, the city on the hill that has all the right ideas and we're just working our way towards perfection. But it's also really problematic to go into this mode of well, look, there's been this central problem since the nation is founded on racism, it was founded on slavery, so the nation's evil, and that there's no real, there's a lack of action that comes when you just say something is horrible and unchangeably horrible because it's based in something horrible. And I think that has its own set of problems as well. And I think, Dr. Moreno, if you're asking, I think, a really important question too about, you mentioned this earlier when you were talking about this idea of someone who's both interested in teaching history, but then also in terms of helping people understand what they can do with history going forward in terms of how they, activism or even just living in society. To what degree do we have a responsibility to try to use the information to create something positive for people, something hopeful for people? It's another issue that I think that this film brought up again that I've found that I've struggled with personally. And I think Baldwin clearly is in the film, right, really struggling with this idea of what is his place in the society? I mean, he leaves the society, right? And then he comes back because he feels like leaving wasn't the right choice. And that in itself is a really fascinating part of the story, especially as someone who's interested in immigration, migration, and all of that, and how that plays into this particular story.
I think that's well said, and a moment in the film that really struck me, even though it might not be clearly central, was right at the beginning when Baldwin talks about his return to the United States. And he begins by saying, I didn't miss anything that was American. I didn't miss baseball, and I didn't miss apple pie, and I didn't miss majorettes, and I didn't miss. And then he says, but I missed Harlem. I missed these faces. I missed fried chicken. I missed this experience. And to me, looking at that and to say that the definition there is that this, in a way, isn't what is American or what is seen as American. That there's sort of this unidirectional aspect of Americanism that's very white, very middle class, very East Coast centric, and that all of these other aspects of the American experience that Baldwin so clearly loves and finds deeply meaningful and deeply significant, that there's a way that he's not comfortable coding those as American in the same way. And I think kind of as a starting note that was that divergence was so profound. Dr. Fair, did you want to add? That looks like you might want to get in.
Yeah, well, I think that what you said about Baldwin and his experiences and those kind of American experiences, the apple pie and the fried chicken and the other kinds of little things are very important, and that those are really the things that make up our lives, are the day-to-day kinds of things that we think about. And so I think that's very significant in the fact that he talks about missing America, and that, I mean, I agree with you that those are the things that he really missed. And he missed his family. He missed having interactions with his close family and his own friends. And so I think those are the oftentimes the most significant things in our lives as well.
Mm-hmm. I think that couldn't be said better. The ways that it can be simultaneously so difficult for us to link in maybe to an abstract idea of America, an idea of America that we might feel along lines of race and class and gender, that we're really sort of separate from, but that we don't necessarily see these aspects of local community and local connection as being American in the same way, which I think is really interesting. I'm noticing just a couple of comments in the sidebar. So I'll begin with Dr. Chiswick, talking about white violence, basically with the explicit aim of starting a race war. Baldwin not really addressing that directly, although certainly referring at times to the undercurrent of white violence, but kind of thinking about what people who are taking those actions, what they're aiming for, how they think this would benefit America, and I think that we could even extend the question to thinking about people who are engaged in these acts of division now, even if those don't necessarily raise to the level of actual physical violence. If we can speculate maybe about what is motivating their actions, which is always difficult, but I think probably still worthwhile to also contemplate that idea of America.
Is this open for either of us, or?
Sure. Yes,
oh, okay.
I should have said that. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. It's a really interesting question in a sense, because I think in some ways what the question does, I mean, I can't answer like what people's ultimate goal is. I'm not 100% sure on that, but I think what's interesting to me about that question is how it sort of connects to when looking through this film and seeing the ways in which like there's this very, very in the 1950s and 60s, you have this much more visible than today, or maybe starting to be visible again, which is in some way scary, but explicit conversation from some within the society about racialized violence being a positive in order to continue to maintain power and control over a subjugated group, right? And I think that sort of became less acceptable, certainly through most of my life, and now it's becoming somewhat more acceptable again. What's interesting to me, though, is that within this, like Baldwin, for example, it doesn't seem like that concerned about the distinction between those groups and like generally the American society overall, because he does this thing that's really interesting to me, which is that he keeps saying, he mentioned this multiple times in arguments with people, that like, I can't know what's in somebody's heart and I can't know what they really want, right? But I can tell you what the institutions they're part of or what their actions are actually saying and doing. And so everything I can base my answer on is off of those particular things, right? And so his answer to that, and I think in some ways we connected the question here as well about like, what is it that people really want? It seems like that's fundamentally a story of preserving a power structure that they see under threat, right? I mean, everything's framed in this kind of zero-sum game of somebody getting to come to the school is going to deny my child their ability in this thing. Someone being able to be part of this neighborhood is going to deny me the opportunity to be in that neighborhood. And that strikes me as a very fortunate way of thinking, but it also seems like fairly common to still exist right now. And so that's the best I think I can answer that in some ways.
Yeah, Aurora, did you want to?
I had a question, actually, if it's okay.
Yeah, of course.
Baldwin talks about, or he doesn't explicitly say there is systematic racism, but obviously we're hearing that a lot lately. So much so that the AG, Bill Barr, has even said, no, systematic racism does not exist in the United States of America. I want to know seeing as how we do have systematic racism in America, what is the responsibility of white America to help equality along its path for Black Americans?
Dr. Fair?
I guess I won't say I'll try to answer. I'll just give a perspective on it. It's hard to define things between, what's the responsibility for white Americans, what's the responsibility for Black Americans, what's the responsibility for immigrants, what's the responsibility for adults, or what's the responsibility for men, or what's the responsibility for children, or what's the responsibilities for males or females. I think that you have to just look at all of those groups and not define people by their individual characteristics or traits. I think the responsibility for all of us is to try to live with one another and get along with one another, and educate ourselves so that we feel that we have some degree of kinship with the other people in our community. And I think as long as we continue to try to define people by their racial or their age or their ethnic backgrounds, I think we run into difficulties. So I would prefer not to identify those people and say that this is a particular group has a certain kind of responsibility.
I like that perspective, and I think that really ties into one of the most interesting aspects of Baldwin's work to me, which is this real focus on effect, right? This is exactly what Dr. Naqvi is saying as well. Baldwin is saying that he can't know what's in somebody else's heart. He isn't particularly concerned with what's in somebody else's heart. What he is concerned about is the effects that we're seeing in the real world. What neighborhood can I live in? Can I join your union? What is my education like? What will my children's educations be like? And I think to me, this is particularly interesting given the shifts that I've seen over my own life, which to me seem profound, and for a long time seemed to me like a trajectory, and now seem more like a circle. When I see Baldwin addressing these issues in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, it seemed like we wanted for so long to pretend, to imagine that we had, quote unquote, gotten over some of these problems, that what we needed to worry about was sort of the virulent racist. We needed to worry about the individual with a bad heart, as opposed to what were the systemic effects on people? What are people's like? What are the opportunities that are available to them? And it does seem like now in the contemporary rhetoric surrounding Black Lives Matter and other activist group, that this perspective really seems to be predominating over a concern about, moral condemnation of just, you have bad opinions or something like that, there's a shift in approach there. I do also think with regard to Suzanne's question that might link in well to a conversation about reparations, what is being requested when people talk about those ideas and what they're intended to do. Dr. Naqvi, I think you want to get in. I'm not sure if that's something you might want to address. I know Ta-Nehisi Coates has talked about this a lot, and you referenced him before. So.
No, thank you for, it was something that I was just thinking about as well, was this connection to that same question, right? And one of the things I think is really interesting, and this might sound like that's a tangent, but I promise it's going to lead this way back. One of the things I think is really interesting in the film is the framing of Baldwin as a witness, right? He talks about this idea that he's not actually an activist. He's not somebody who's involved in organizing. He's not someone who's involved in even his reluctance to ally himself with any of these organizations, right? Which I actually think is an interesting way of framing the film, because I think also part of why he doesn't want to ally himself with a lot of these organizations is that as a non-heterosexual man, I think he faced a lot of discrimination on that, and they sort of like wiped that from the story, which is really interesting on its own sake. But I think that's part of the stuff that sort of filters into his mindset on this. And I think because he's taking this witness approach, he doesn't really bring up this concrete solution approach. He's a commentator. He's seeing what's happening. He's commentating on it. He's not really offering a solution to the problem. And that's where I think for us, it's like kind of hard to like look at this and then try to be like, okay, so what is Baldwin saying on that? I think the answer is Baldwin's not saying anything on that. But when we're trying to then apply some of these ideas, or at least sort of lessons that he's laying forward, right? I think this goes back to this optimism pessimism thing in a way, which is that like, if you're saying that the fundamental structures of the society are built on this fundamental problem of having to create, the N word, right, and that's at the core of what the country is about, then I don't think it's as simple as even saying like, well, we could give some reparations and that'll fix the problem, right? Or we will, we have to have a mentality that's more open-minded to be able to solve the problem. He's seeing something that in some ways is very scary because it's at the very root, right? And if there's something's problem at the root, you kind of have to rip the whole tree out, right? And if that's the case, does that mean you have to completely rethink the system that we live in? I mean, you can tell even in his writing, right? He's got a very clear critique of capitalism in this thing. He's consistently going back to this idea that there's this profits thing. People are with an F, not a PH. That the people who stand to benefit from the system in a very serious way. And he seems to be very, very much attuned to the notion that consumerism is an empty lifestyle and it leads to emptiness. And so, in some ways, this idea of reparations is not actually that challenging to the system. It's basically saying, hey, there are people who've been excluded from being able to have these full inclusion in the system. If we just gave them some capital, because the system is based off of capital, they'll be able to have the inclusion and the problem will be solved, right? And I think so. When talking about this idea of like, what is it that white Americans have to do, or if you want to think larger about it, like, what do we do systematically in the country to change that? Well, I think part of it has to do with like, people have to have come to some sort of understanding about what is the problem in the society, right? Is the problem that there was a longstanding harm that had been done in the past that has repercussions to today that are economic primarily? That's like a Coates type argument. Well, the way you would solve an economic problem is through an economic solution, right? And even Martin Luther King Jr. starts advocating for that before he's assassinated, right? He's basically arguing for black reparations at the time of his death. And having traveled to India, Martin Luther King Jr. Had seen the conversations going there around caste and about how do we fix the problem with Dalits and having special reservation systems so that they would be able to have political power and be able to have economic opportunity. And he literally imports that to the United States and says, these are great ideas, we want to use those here. But if you don't see the problem as simply being a story of long-standing economic disenfranchisement and that can be fixed economically, then you have a very different problem to deal with, right? And if you look at the legacy of Black intellectual life in the United States, people have had very different interpretations on this, right? Malcolm X wasn't sitting there for the majority of his life just saying, hey, give us a little bit more money and everything will be fine. I mean, he said the root of the problem is fundamentally an issue that there will always be this exclusion that exists and there will always be this sense of wanting to be with one's own kind. Well, then maybe the answer is essentially, separation. And it's interesting, I was just reading in the newspaper just yesterday in Georgia, like these 19 families of African Americans from around the Atlanta area have all bought land together outside of Atlanta, and they're building this like a town that they think is going to be free of the racism that they face in their daily life because it's going to be a Black town. And that's not the first people to do that. People have been doing that, in American history, that's a tried and true tradition in some ways. And so if that's the way in which you see the problem in America, then I think you'll have come up with a very different solution. And similarly, if you're going to go to the level that Baldwin does, which is that essentially that at the root of this nation's ideals, they had to build something monstrous and there's a moral monstrosity at the center of the nation. I don't know what solution you have for that. I mean, I don't. I wish I could tell you something more concrete, but that just seems very scary to me. And so I don't know. I wish I could answer that, but at least does that in some ways gets at this issue about like how do reparations fit into a story like this? So.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's an excellent answer. And I agree with you in your interpretation of Baldwin, who I think himself saw himself so much as an interpreter, right? I will recommend it for anybody who hasn't read it, particularly the Ta-Nehisi Coates article, The Case for Reparations, which appeared in The Atlantic, as well as subsequent work that Coates has done with regard to telling that story. I think one of the most interesting aspects of that work is the importance that Coates really places on the telling of the story, of not just the idea of reparations themselves, but on the idea of making this clear how the situation has unfolded, how things came to be the way that they are, which again, I think we really see the legacy of Baldwin there. Dr. Fay, did you want to jump in?
Yes, I just wanted to say that I'm going to have to lead the discussion. I've got another commitment that I have to get to. So I want to say thank you for everybody for coming and taking a part in this and being a part of this. And we'll have another one, I think, in another month or so. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for joining us and for contributing. We really appreciate it.
Good. You're quite welcome.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So I think that hit on a couple of the important questions in the comments. Yeah. Anybody else from the comments wanting to contribute? Okay, hands up. Erin, go ahead.
Yeah, so I just wanted you guys to think a little bit out loud about the relationship between sort of the individual and the collective in this. And let me see if I can come up with two concrete examples. I'm a literary scholar, so as I was watching this, I was thinking of it like in terms of African American literary history. And there's some ways in which it's his personal memoir, right? Like these are his memories of his friends who were murdered. He came back from Paris because he wanted to be a witness to the civil rights movement. But it's also simultaneously a history of Black folks in America, right? So it's both an individual and a collective story. And the other thing that made me think about this was at the end, and I'm cleaning this up a little, he's saying like to white folks, I'm not your Negro, right? Like I'm my own man. This is you, you know, that's your issue. That's your definition. But also like elsewhere, he says, I don't join any church because y'all are not behaving like Christians. Sorry about my dog. I'm not joining the NAACP because it's just for rich people, right? So there's a way in which he's defining himself both as part of and against these institutions. And now I'm going to mute myself because of the dog.
So actually, Dr. Smith, thank you for saying this. It's really so glad that you mentioned this. It's actually one of the things that I struggled with when I watched the film the first time, which is that like, that moment where he's like, okay, let me just tell you why everybody who's involved in the fight is not someone that I really am going to join. And I actually struggled with that a little bit because on the one hand, like he later rebukes the professor from Yale who is making the argument that we're all individuals and that group identity is nonsensical, essentially, because he's like, no, group identity does matter because we have lived experiences that are shared and are different, and it's a particular set of shared lived experiences that Black Americans have, right? And yet at the same time, he's sort of like, okay, everybody else who's in the fight, I think they all have problems, and so maybe I'm better off as just a witness to this thing. And I think that that's like in some ways like kind of convenient. There's a piece of me that like, I think as a scholar, not an activist, I feel some element of complicity in that same thought process at times. And then I think I look back on it and I'm like, is that very just like a cowardly way of saying like, I don't really want to do stuff, you know, and that I'd rather just watch, right? And I think it's really interesting that he frames this, that's framed in the film, you know, and that he writes about it in that way. And I was actually like, it's something that I really wondered about, you know, how much more of his own self-reflection is on that particular question or that particular point about how he fits into the story and his individual identity, and how much of his individual identity is left out of the story because the way in which this is framed is choosing to, you know, exclude some like really critical stuff about what he wrote about when it comes to sexuality. And so there's a lot of stuff in the film that I left being puzzled by, you know, in terms of like oh my gosh, to go back to this point about that Dean Fair brought up, right? Like the idea that, you know, he says that I miss nothing about American culture. I don't miss waffles or ice cream or baseball or, you know, all these other things, right? And then he's like, but I do miss, you know, fried chicken and my mother and, you know, like all these other things. And I know that he knows that he's setting up the idea that Black culture is not American culture, right? And I know that later on he's very eloquently states how much that is fundamentally not true, right? And I know that that's not cognitive dissonance, or at least maybe I don't know that. I assume that that's not just cognitive dissonance. You know, he's a man far smarter than I am, and I picked up on that right away, right? And the juxtaposition of the two lines, that can't possibly be because he just like doesn't get what he's saying, right? So then I was like, and I've like watched this now a couple of times, and I'm just like, I don't know precisely what the purpose is for presenting it that way. And it's part of the reason why I was so relieved to find out that there are people who are, you know, more insightful than just a historian here to talk about that, because I was hoping somebody else could solve that when without me just being like, well, that doesn't seem to make sense. You know? So thank you for raising some of these kind of points about the fact that it is literary work.
No, I think that that's a great question, Aaron. You know, and I've always been so fascinated by the ways that Baldwin talks about his comings and goings and his time in France and his time in the US. I think because it's something that even as sort of as Dr. Nakvi said, I see Baldwin as being so incredibly brilliant in a stratospheric way that has nothing in common with my experience. There's something that seems so familiar to me about being like, I'm done with this bullshit, and like really meaning it in the moment, and then being like 2 years later being like, but I'm back. You know, and kind of watching Baldwin grapple with that, like grapple simultaneously with the way that he is of America and is deeply resistant to that. You know, and to me, I think quite a bit of what I kind of see there is feeling as though in America in particular, that there might not be a lot of choice involved, that because of biases and stereotyping and the ways that American culture has developed, that sort of to be classified as a Black man, as an activist, as, you know, a member of a particular religion and so forth, that there is something in Baldwin that's deeply resistant to that, because I look in juxtaposition at the ways that he so proactively formed community and contributed to community in France in his life as an expat, and seemed to be very sort of unambivalently engaged in some of those cultural projects. You know, and he speaks so explicitly about finding France freeing in a particular way. And so I wonder if those burdens of representation, affiliation, and things like that are part of what's at play there. I'm not sure. I may be a historian dodging a literary scholar's question. I probably am. But Aaron, we're really, really glad that you're here to take us to task, so that we don't just have two historians, you know, going off in the weeds.
Not at all. That's exactly what I was asking about. But for me, I was like, there's a way in which this is like a slave narrative, in the sense that it's a personal story, but it's also a collective history. Right. You know, so that it's that same tension, right? Like, do you claim the specificity? Are you making the case for yourself as an individual? So yeah, no, this was great. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, and to, I mean, I don't think we necessarily have so much time for this, but, you know, the element of pastiche in this is really, really fascinating to me, both in kind of Baldwin's own work, and then also the way the film is constructed with the advertisements, the film clips, the songs, the letters, you know, and what I really noticed is the images of contemporary America mixed into some of the montages, without really providing any context for the audience. But of course, we know when we see a picture of Times Square with a Samsung sign or something, we're being clued in really obviously to the fact that there's a visual connection being drawn there between past and present. I don't know, Dr. Nakvi, if there's anything you noticed about that, or kind of thought about the construction of the film itself as the work of art?
Well, I was really blown away by the choices when it came to the media they utilized, particularly because, you know, that is in some ways a disconnection from the work that it's deriving from, right? I mean, like, it's not like in these pages that Baldwin had written, he was like just dropping every single reference he could to every film that he'd seen, right? And so it's really cool how they kind of utilize those images to sort of drive home some of these points that were being abstractly discussed in some of Baldwin's work there. And I personally found those to be like very halting. You know, I'm not actually that familiar with film from the 1930s and the 1940s all the way up through the 50s. And I think the one that they do, which is like a little later on, the one that I think is most halting in some ways is when when he brings up this notion that, like, the pure innocence of the story that comes from some of these films, right? And I've now already forgotten the name of the actor and actress pair that they are, Doris Day and It'll come to me in 5 minutes and it'll be too late. Anyway, but so, you know, there's this beautiful dancing and these scenes of like, kind of like innocence and freedom from a burden. And then the contrast to the idea of like, look at the lyrics and expression of Ray Charles in this music, right? Like, how can these two things exist at once? And we're, I think, sort of consistently, like what struck me about that was the idea that he says that we are given these two contrasting images that at once exist at the same place and are consumed by some of the same people, and nobody's able, not nobody, but most people don't reconcile the fact that, like, how can these both exist at the same time? What does that say about our society? But that statement's so true in 2020 as it is in, you know, 1965, as it is in like 1840, right? Or even earlier. Right. I think that's like one of the things that really struck me about like making that point abstractly versus getting to see that visually. That like really stuck with me. And so that use of American culture to tell these stories, I think was really powerful. You know, it's one thing to remember the idea of, oh, you know, these old John Wayne movies shooting Indians, and then just seeing the, you know, the grotesque characterizations in them and being like, my goodness, like growing up with this being surrounding you, you know, and then to get the perspective of the fact that, like, it's not like the world changed and fixed itself at one point, right? I'm certain that, you know, looking back on things from my childhood, that if I critically examine them, I'll be like, look at the grotesqueness of this thing from the 90s, right? You know, or from the 2000s, right? I know from the younger stuff, but like, that's the case still, you know, and so I think that's a good reminder in some ways of the way in which that can shape the psyche of people.
Yeah, I think that is a fantastic evaluation of that. And I think that will stand well as a last word since we are right at time. I want to thank you, Dr. Nakavi, for joining us, for participating, for all of your insight and the effort that you put in to helping us discuss and understand the film. I also really want to offer my thanks to Aurora and Dante for all the work that they have done in putting this together. They have just the hours and the tinkering that they have done to make this possible is really incredible, and I am so grateful to them. And I also want to thank everybody for coming and participating in the screening and also the conversation. We've got 2 more of these during the remainder of the fall semester, so I hope that you will join us again. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you. See you at the next one.